He walked into one of the most prestigious banks in the city wearing a faded jacket and scuffed shoes, carrying nothing but a folded piece of paper. He asked the teller for $50, just 50. And the most powerful woman in the room, the kind who owned boardrooms and intimidated lawyers, looked at him like he was something stuck to the bottom of her heel. She laughed, out loud, in front of everyone. What happened next silenced the entire bank. If you're new here, subscribe and hit that bell. You will not want to miss what's coming. Drop your city or country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The line at Meridian Trust had been moving slowly all morning. It was a Tuesday, which meant the branch on Callaway Street was running at full capacity. Office workers on lunch breaks, small business owners juggling deposit slips, a couple of older regulars who came in person because they didn't trust the app. The air smelled like recycled air conditioning and fresh printer paper, and the low murmur of the space was the kind of white noise that made people impatient without quite knowing why. Damian Cross joined the back of the line at 11:47 a.m. He didn't draw attention when he walked in. That wasn't unusual. Most people didn't. But Damian was the kind of man who seemed almost deliberately invisible. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, medium height, medium build, the sort of face that was hard to describe after the fact. He wore a dark jacket that had seen better years, a plain gray shirt underneath, dark trousers with a crease that had faded from too many washes. His shoes were clean but worn at the toes. He carried no briefcase, no laptop bag, no watch worth noting. He pulled a folded slip of paper from his jacket pocket, checked it once, folded it back, and stood quietly in line with his hands at his sides. The woman ahead of him was different in every possible way. Vanessa Sterling arrived at Meridian Trust the way she arrived everywhere, like the space had been waiting for her. She was in her early 50s, impeccably assembled, wearing a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, her dark hair cut in a way that probably cost more than some people's car payments. She wore a watch that caught the light from the overhead fixtures, and she carried a slim leather portfolio that she kept checking as if something inside it might have changed since the last time she looked. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with a rhythm that suggested she operated on a schedule that other people were expected to respect. She worked her phone while she waited, responding to emails with the kind of clipped efficiency that made the air around her feel pressurized. When the line moved, she moved. When it stopped, she exhaled through her nose. Damian watched none of this. He was looking at the far wall where a printed notice about fraud protection had been taped slightly crooked. He stared at it for a while. Then he looked at the floor. There were 6 people between them when Vanessa finally reached the front. The teller she approached was a young woman named Priya, maybe 23, 24, new enough that she still straightened her name badge out of habit when someone important-looking stepped up. She smiled at Vanessa with the bright, careful smile of someone who had been trained to make everyone feel welcome and had not yet been worn down enough to stop meaning it. "Good morning, Ms. Sterling. How can I help you today?" Vanessa barely looked up from her phone. "I need to confirm a wire transfer went through, account ending in 7742. It should have posted yesterday and I don't see it reflected yet." "Of course. Let me pull that up," Priya typed. Vanessa scrolled. The people behind them waited. The transaction had posted. Priya confirmed it, gave the details, answered 2 follow-up questions without hesitating, and managed to maintain the smile throughout, even as Vanessa's responses got shorter and more clipped. When it was done, Vanessa clicked the portfolio shut, slid her phone into her jacket pocket, and moved to step away. That was when Damian stepped forward. He didn't rush. He didn't bump into her. He simply moved into the space she'd left and said, quietly and without any particular emotion, "Hi. I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." Vanessa had not fully moved away. She was still close enough that she heard the number when Priya asked and Damian answered, $50. The words landed softly. Damian said it the same way someone might say they needed a coffee. No emphasis, no apology. Priya nodded. "Sure, no problem. Can I get your account information?" Damian slid a card across the counter. It was Vanessa who reacted first. She had half turned to go, but something made her stop. Maybe it was the number. Maybe it was the jacket. Maybe she was just the kind of person who couldn't let certain things pass without comment. $50? She said. She wasn't talking to Damian directly. It was the kind of statement aimed slightly to the side, addressed to the general air, loud enough that it didn't need to be directed at anyone to land. They let people come in here for $50? A man in line behind Damien cleared his throat uncomfortably. Someone else looked at their phone. Priya kept her eyes on her screen. Damien didn't turn around. Vanessa watched him for a moment, waiting for a reaction, and when none came, something in her seemed to sharpen. "I'm serious," she said, and now her voice had a texture to it, not cruel exactly, but dismissive in a way that didn't hide itself. "This is a private banking branch. There are ATMs on every corner. What exactly is the point of tying up a teller for a $50 transaction?" A few people in line shifted. One woman near the back looked away. The man beside her studied the ceiling. Priya still hadn't looked up. Damien finally turned. Not fast. Not with any visible heat. He just turned his head and looked at Vanessa Sterling for a moment, calm, unhurried, and then turned back to the counter without saying a single word. That seemed to irritate Vanessa more than anything he could have said. "Unbelievable," she muttered, clicking her portfolio against her palm once, and then her phone buzzed, and she answered it and walked toward the door. And the room let out a collective breath so subtle nobody would have admitted it happened. Priya ran the card. Typed something, paused. She typed something else. Then she frowned. Not in a bad way, more the way someone frowns when a number is bigger than expected, and leaned slightly toward her screen. She checked the card again. Checked the screen again. Her hand moved to her phone. "Just one moment, sir." Damien nodded. Priya dialed an internal extension. She spoke quietly, her hand partially covering her mouth, but the branch was quiet enough that certain words carried. "Account." "Yes. Portfolio. I just wanted to confirm." She paused, listening, said, "Yes, thank you," and hung up. She looked at Damien. The professional smile was still there, but it had shifted. There was something more careful in it now, the way you might treat a package that turned out to weigh far more than it looked. "Mr. Cross," she said, "would you prefer to take that from your checking account or from one of the investment portfolios?" Damien thought about it for half a second. "Checking is fine." Priya nodded, counted out 5 tens, set them in the small tray under the window. Behind them, nothing had changed on the surface. The line had shuffled forward. Phones were being checked, deposit slips were being reviewed, but something in the atmosphere had shifted in the way that things sometimes shift in public spaces, quietly, without announcement, felt before it's understood. The branch manager came out from the back hallway. His name was Gerald Taft, a man in his early 60s who had worked at Meridian Trust for over 2 decades. He wore a dark suit and moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who chose every step consciously. He came around the side counter and walked directly toward Damien, and he extended his hand before he'd fully arrived. "Mr. Cross," Gerald said, "I wasn't aware you were coming in today. We would have had someone available for you." Damien shook his hand. "I was in the area. It wasn't planned." Of course. Gerald gestured toward the seating area near the back wall, a small cluster of chairs arranged around a low table, the kind of space the branch kept for clients who needed a quieter conversation. "Do you have a few minutes? We had some updated statements prepared for next month, but I can have them ready today if you'd like to review." "I'm okay for now," Damien said. "I just needed the cash." Gerald nodded, but he didn't move away immediately. He stood there a moment with the easy comfort of someone who knew that the person in front of him had earned that comfort. "Well, the offer stands. Anything you need, just call ahead, and we'll have it ready." "I appreciate that." Gerald shook his hand again and walked back toward his office. The line had gone quiet, not silent. People were still doing their things, fingers moving over phones, a woman near the door adjusting her bag, but the low, ambient murmur of the space had dropped a register, the way sound does when people stop making it deliberately and start making it only incidentally because they are, in fact, very focused on something else. Damien folded the bills, put them in his jacket pocket, and picked up his card from the tray. Priya was watching him with a different expression than she'd had 7 minutes ago. "Have a good day, Mr. Cross," she said. "You too," Damien said. He turned to go. He was 3 steps from the counter when Vanessa Sterling stepped back through the front door. She'd been out on the sidewalk. Her phone call had ended, or maybe she'd forgotten something, or maybe she'd just stopped moving long enough for something nagging in the back of her mind to catch up to her. She stood in the entrance for a moment, portfolio in hand, and her eyes found the counter where Gerald had just disappeared through the back hallway, and then they found Damien, who was walking toward the exit. She watched him. Then she looked at Priya, who was already serving the next customer, but whose posture had changed, straighter, more deliberate. Vanessa's eyes moved back to the ordinary-looking man in the faded jacket, who was pushing through the glass door and stepping out into the gray afternoon without hurry, without theatrics, without looking back. Something about the picture didn't fit. The number sat in her chest in a way she couldn't quite shake. Not $50. No, the other one. The one Gerald had implied without saying, that she'd caught in the way a person catches the shape of a word from across the room without quite hearing it. She watched the door close behind Damien Cross, and she stood very still for a moment in the middle of the lobby, holding her portfolio, surrounded by people who were carefully not looking at her. She walked to the counter. The customer at Priya's window finished and moved off, and Vanessa stepped up before anyone else could. "That man," she said. Not accusatory, just direct, the way she said most things. Priya looked at her pleasantly. "I'm sorry?" "The man who was just at your window, the one Manager Taft came out to speak with." Priya kept her expression neutral with the particular practiced skill of someone who knew that some questions were about information and some were about something else entirely. "I'm not able to discuss other clients," she said. "I'm sure you understand." Vanessa held her gaze for a beat. "I understand," she said finally. She stepped back from the counter. Across the lobby, through the glass, the street outside was ordinary. Taxis, pedestrians, pigeons on the curb. And Damien Cross was gone, absorbed into the afternoon with the complete, frictionless ease of someone who had never needed anyone to notice him in the first place. Vanessa stood in the middle of Meridian Trust's marble lobby and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She couldn't name it yet, but she felt it. She didn't ask anyone about him that afternoon. That was the thing Vanessa told herself later, that she had let it go, that she'd walked out of Meridian Trust and gotten into her car and moved on with her day the way she always moved on, efficiently and without backward glances. She had a 2 o'clock with her VP of operations and a call with her legal team at 4, and there was a dinner reservation at 7 that she couldn't cancel because the person she was meeting with had already rescheduled twice, and her patience for that kind of thing had worn thin around the 3rd year of running her own company. She did all of it. She was present for all of it. She answered questions and made decisions and signed off on 2 documents that her attorney needed by end of business. But at some point during the operations meeting, while her VP Marcus was walking through a slide about projected growth in their Pacific Coast distribution network, Vanessa's pen stopped moving. She was looking at the table. She was seeing, without meaning to, the look on Gerald Taft's face when he'd come out from the back hallway. Not deferential exactly, but something adjacent to it. Careful. The way people are careful around weight they've learned to respect. She picked up her pen again. She asked Marcus a question about the quarterly numbers. She did not think about it again until she was lying awake at 20 past midnight, and by then it had been nagging at her long enough that she did the thing she almost never let herself do. She called in a favor. Her contact at Meridian Trust wasn't Gerald Taft. It was a man named Douglas Finch, who worked in private wealth management and who owed Vanessa a quiet debt from 4 years back involving a real estate deal that could have gone sideways for his brother-in-law without her intervention. She'd never called in the favor. She called it now. Doug didn't give her numbers. He was careful enough for that. And she wouldn't have asked him to cross that line, but he confirmed enough. He used the word significant. He used the phrase long-standing relationship. He paused after she said the name Damien Cross, and the pause itself was information. "That's all I can tell you, Vanessa," he said. "That's enough," she said. She set her phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Damien Cross. She turned the name over. It didn't ring anything. And she knew names. That was a skill she'd spent years sharpening, the ability to map a name to an industry, a company, a deal, a reputation. The financial world wasn't small exactly, but it had patterns, and Vanessa had spent enough time inside those patterns to recognize most of the shapes. Damian Cross produced nothing. No shape. No echo. Just the image of a man in a worn jacket counting out a $50 withdrawal and thanking a bank teller in a quiet voice. She didn't sleep well. The next morning, she had her assistant, a sharp and thoroughly unflappable woman named Cora, run a search. Not an aggressive one, just a scan. Name, professional history, any publicly filed documents, any corporate affiliations. The kind of thing that took 20 minutes and usually turned up a LinkedIn profile and a few press mentions. Cora came back in 45 minutes, which was longer than 20, and set a printed summary on Vanessa's desk without comment. Vanessa read it once. Then she read it again more slowly. Then she put it face down on her desk and sat back in her chair and looked out the window at the city spread out below her 43rd floor office. And she thought about the way she'd said $50 in that bank lobby, loud enough for 6 people to hear, like the amount was an insult to the building's architecture. Damian Cross had not always been invisible. 15 years ago, he'd been the kind of name that moved in certain rooms. Not famous, not the sort of person who ended up in magazines, but known. He had co-founded a financial technology company called ArcLight Systems in his mid-30s, building it over 7 years from a 2-person operation running out of a leased office space in an unremarkable building in the financial district into something that managed risk analysis software for mid-size institutional investors. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't the kind of company that got splashed across business publications. But it was solid. It was precise. And it made serious money for the people who used it and the people who built it. His business partner had been a man named Carter Voss. Vanessa had heard of Carter Voss. Most people in her world had. He was the kind of figure who left marks. Charming, aggressive, the sort of operator who could make a room feel like he'd invented it. He and Damian had built ArcLight together, but the structure of the partnership had been, according to what Cora had managed to piece together from public filings and a few archived industry pieces, quietly unequal in ways that weren't obvious until they were catastrophic. What happened was this. Carter Voss had, over the course of approximately 18 months, restructured the company's equity arrangements through a series of legal maneuvers that Damian had trusted him to manage. The details were technical and by design difficult to follow. The outcome was not difficult to follow at all. When ArcLight Systems was acquired by a larger firm in what looked from the outside like a clean and successful exit, Damian Cross walked away with a fraction of what he'd built. Carter Voss walked away very comfortably indeed. There was no lawsuit. There had been, apparently, a period where one seemed possible, a few references in archived trade publications to a dispute among founders that had been resolved, but nothing went to court. Cora had found one quote from an unnamed source published in a small industry newsletter roughly 12 years ago that read, "The cleaner play was to walk away. He walked away." Vanessa read that line 3 times. She thought about what it cost. Walking away from something you'd built over 7 years because the legal fight would cost more than what remained. She thought about what kind of man did that quietly. What the summary didn't explain, and what Vanessa found herself most unsettled by, was what came after. Because after the ArcLight exit, after Carter Voss and the restructured equity and the decision to not fight, Damian Cross had simply disappeared from any professional record for almost 2 years. No new company, no public role, no speaking appearances at the kind of industry conferences that people in his position typically used to stay visible. And then, gradually, he'd started investing. Not loudly. Not in the way that people invest when they're trying to rebuild a reputation or announce a comeback. He'd invested the way someone plays chess when they're not in a hurry, methodically across a wide range of sectors, with what the financial record suggested was an extremely precise read on long-term value in companies that were either undervalued or simply overlooked. He'd taken positions in businesses that looked unremarkable on the surface and held them for years, sometimes for a decade. He'd exited a handful of them at multiples that would have made people in Vanessa's circle genuinely envious. He'd done all of it without a profile, without a platform, without a single interview. The number at Meridian Trust, the one Doug Finch had danced around without saying, was, as far as Vanessa could calculate from the public pieces of the picture, somewhere in the range that her own company's total valuation had only recently crossed. She sat with that for a while. Then she went to her next meeting. What Vanessa didn't know, couldn't have found in any document because it had never been written down, was the specific Tuesday morning in October, 11 years ago, when Damian Cross had sat at a folding table in a half-empty apartment and made a decision that changed the shape of the rest of his life. He'd had money then. Not a lot. What remained after the ArcLight settlement had covered his debts and left him with a cushion that felt significant and also, in certain moments, like a joke. But enough. Enough to rent the apartment, enough to eat, enough to think. He'd spent those first months in a particular kind of fog that he didn't talk about and wouldn't have known how to describe if someone had asked. He wasn't depressed exactly. He was something more specific than that. He was a man who had spent the better part of a decade building something with his hands and his mind and more late nights than he could count, and who had learned, in the space of about 4 months, that the structure he thought he was building inside had been built around a hollow center. Carter Voss had been his friend first. That was the part that didn't go away. They'd met in a graduate program 20 years back, two people who thought differently about the same problems and found that useful, and then found each other genuinely funny, and then found themselves, somewhat to their mutual surprise, actually close. Damian had been the one who called Carter when his mother died. Carter had been the one who showed up. He thought about that a lot in those first months. He thought about it less as time went on, but it never fully left. It just became one of those weights you carry so long that you stop noticing it until something reminds you it's there. The decision he made at the folding table that October morning was not dramatic. He didn't write it down. He didn't tell anyone. He simply looked at what he had left. The money, the knowledge, the hard-won understanding of how value actually moved through markets and why most people misread it. And he decided what to do with it. He would not rebuild ArcLight. He would not start another company. He would not walk back into the world where Carter Voss operated and fight for a position in it. Not because he was afraid, though there were moments that felt adjacent to fear, but because he understood, sitting at that table, that what he wanted was not what that world offered. What he wanted was to be correct, to make good decisions over a long time horizon and have those decisions be his own, accountable to no one, unreadable to the people who'd looked at him and seen something other than what was there. The invisibility had been incidental at first. He'd stopped dressing for an image he no longer maintained and found that without the image, people looked through him and found that being looked through was deeply, unexpectedly restful. He kept the apartment modest because the apartment served its purpose. He drove an unremarkable car because it got him where he was going. He didn't need the signal. He'd spent years around people who needed the signal, who measured themselves by the signal. And he understood now, with the clarity that only comes from having lost something, and then sat quietly with the loss long enough to see it clearly, that the signal had never actually been the point. The point was the work, and the work was going well. His first major position had been in a mid-sized logistics company that most analysts had written off as structurally obsolete. He'd read their internal filings differently, had seen something in the operational data that suggested the obsolescence narrative was built on the wrong assumptions, and had bought in at a price that made his attorney at the time ask carefully whether he was certain. He was certain. He held the position for 6 years. When he finally moved, the return was substantial enough that his attorney called him back, unprompted, to say I should have listened. He'd smiled at that. He was in a coffee shop when the call came, wearing a jacket he'd had for 3 years, reading a book he'd been meaning to get to for 2. He'd thanked the attorney and gone back to his book. The years had that quality. Not peaceful exactly, because there was always something to track, always a decision to be worked through, always the low hum of attention that serious investing required. But they had a consistency to them, a groundedness. He woke up in the morning and knew what he was doing and why, and that was more than a lot of people had, and he knew it. He'd kept a small circle, a couple of people he'd known before ArcLight, a handful he'd met through the investing work, one former colleague who'd stayed in touch across the years without ever seeming to want anything from the staying in touch. He didn't date much. There'd been a woman named Sylvie for about 2 years early in this chapter, and the ending of that had been one of the less graceful things he'd managed, too much silence on his part when she'd needed the opposite, and he didn't make excuses for it, just carried it as another thing on the list of ways he was not as good as he probably should have been. He'd been better at the solitude than the closeness. That was a true thing about him that he'd stopped pretending wasn't. His investments now touched a wide range of sectors: real estate, technology infrastructure, a couple of manufacturing companies he'd found through the same kind of careful reading that had served him well the first time around. He managed everything himself, with an attorney and an accountant who understood his particular approach to both privacy and patience. He didn't sit on boards. He didn't take active roles in the companies he backed. He read, he analyzed, he decided, he waited. One of those companies was a firm called Archon Ventures, which was a growth stage investment vehicle that had, about 6 years ago, provided significant capital to a fast-expanding business technology company looking to scale into 3 new markets simultaneously. The company had been Vanessa Sterling's. Damien had found Sterling Integrated Solutions the way he found most things, through documents. He'd been reading a sector report on mid-market enterprise software and noticed a privately held company whose client retention numbers were anomalously good, the kind of good that suggested either excellent product or excellent relationships, or, in the interesting cases, both. He'd looked further. He'd liked what he found. He'd made the investment through Archon without any particular interest in who the founder was or what she was like in a room, because what she was like in a room was not relevant to what he was trying to understand. Sterling Integrated Solutions had grown significantly in the years since. His position had grown with it. He had not thought about Vanessa Sterling in any personal sense. She was a name attached to a set of numbers that had performed well. That was the whole of it. He'd gone to the bank on Tuesday because he needed cash for a handyman he'd hired to fix the gutter on the back of his house. A man who worked off the books and asked for exact amounts because he'd learned that the kind of people who needed him to explain digital payment options were usually the kind of people who then had opinions about the job itself. Damien respected the approach. He'd asked what it would cost. The handyman had said $50. Damien had driven to the bank. He was in the shower when his phone buzzed with a message from Gerald Taft's assistant, thanking him for coming in and reminding him that his updated portfolio statements would be ready by end of month. He dried his hands on the edge of the towel and replied, "Thanks. No rush." He made a sandwich. He ate it standing at the kitchen counter, reading something on his phone. Outside, the afternoon had gone overcast, the light that particular flat gray that settles over a city in autumn and makes everything look slightly more honest. He did not think about the woman at the bank. He did not think about the way she'd said $50, or the way the lobby had gone quiet, or the way she'd come back through the door and stood there looking at the counter with an expression he'd caught only for a second before he'd pushed through to the street. He'd heard that particular tone before. Not from Vanessa Sterling specifically, but from the category of person she occupied. He'd spent enough years inside that world to know the precise frequency of it. The assumption that the surface was the thing, that what you presented was what you were, and what you were was determined entirely by what you presented. He didn't feel angry about it in any active way. He'd moved past the anger phase of this a long time ago. He just found it, when he let himself think about it, very tired. The gutter got fixed. The handyman did good work, cleaner than Damien had expected, actually, and faster. He paid the $50 in cash and the man drove away in a truck with a cracked taillight, and Damien went back inside and poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard, which needed the leaves raked, which he would get to over the weekend. His phone buzzed. A message from his accountant with a flag on something in one of his technology positions. Not urgent, just something to review. He fired back a reply, opened the file, read it carefully. Outside, the light was fading. He sat at his desk, the same desk he'd had for 8 years, a plain thing with a surface he'd scratched up over time and never replaced, and he pulled up a spreadsheet and started working through the numbers. And the numbers were interesting, and the afternoon moved on, and by the time he looked up again, it was evening, and the street outside his window was dark and quiet. He'd forgotten about the bank entirely. Somewhere across the city, in a 43rd floor office, with a view that cost a different kind of fortune, Vanessa Sterling was reading a printed summary for the 3rd time and beginning to understand that she'd been wrong about something. Not just about a man in a faded jacket, but about the way she'd been measuring things for longer than she wanted to admit. She wasn't there yet, but she was close. Cora had been Vanessa's assistant for 6 years, which meant she had developed a finely tuned sensitivity to the particular quality of her boss's silences. There was the silence that meant, "I'm thinking and don't interrupt me," which was common and not alarming. There was the silence that meant, "I already made this decision and I'm waiting for you to catch up," which was also common. And then there was the silence Cora encountered on Wednesday morning when she arrived at the office and found Vanessa standing at the window with her coffee going cold in her hand, which was a different variety entirely, rarer and worth paying attention to. "Your 8:30 called to confirm," Cora said, setting a folder on the desk. "And Marcus wants to know if you had a chance to look at the Pacific Coast numbers from yesterday." "Tell Marcus I'll get back to him this afternoon." Cora noted the absence of a response about the 8:30, but didn't push. She started to leave. "Cora?" Vanessa turned from the window. "The Archon Ventures position. The one from 6 years ago. Do we have documentation on who the individual investors were at that level?" Cora's expression stayed professionally neutral. "We have what was disclosed in the original funding agreement. Some of it was structured through vehicles, so the individual names behind them aren't all listed directly." "Pull what we have." "I'll have it in an hour." It took 40 minutes. Cora set the file on the desk and left without comment, which was one of the things Vanessa paid her well to understand: when to be invisible. Vanessa read through the Archon documentation with the specific focus she brought to things that mattered. Archon Ventures had been one of 4 investment vehicles that had provided the growth capital Sterling Integrated Solutions needed in its 3rd year. The year Vanessa had been expanding into markets that were bigger than her existing cash flow could comfortably support. The year she'd spent 6 months having conversations she didn't particularly enjoy with people who wanted pieces of her company in exchange for the runway she needed. Archon had been the cleanest deal on the table. Good terms, minimal interference requirements, no board seat demands, no aggressive reporting schedule. Vanessa had taken it and been grateful for it, and then, in the way that founders do once survival is no longer the immediate question, had largely moved past it. The name behind Archon's position was not Damian Cross. It was a holding entity called Terrace Capital Management, which was registered in Delaware, and which had, according to the paperwork, a single managing principal. The principal's name was D. Cross. Vanessa set the file down. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else, just air leaving her body while she processed the specific geometry of what she was looking at. Damian Cross had been an investor in her company for 6 years. He had provided capital that had, without exaggeration, made the difference between Sterling Integrated Solutions becoming what it was and remaining something smaller and more fragile. He had done it quietly, through a structure that kept his name off the surface of things, and he had taken no active role, asked for no recognition, and made no attempt in 6 years to trade the fact of his investment for access or influence. She thought about Tuesday morning, the lobby of Meridian Trust, the way she'd said the words. Her face did something that she was glad no one was there to see. She picked up her phone, put it down, picked it up again. What she wanted to do and what was appropriate were not the same thing, and she understood that, so she sat with the discomfort for the rest of the morning and got through her 8:30 and the 2 calls that followed it and ate half a sandwich at her desk at 1 o'clock without tasting it. At 2:15, she told Cora she needed Damian Cross's contact information. Cora, to her credit, did not ask why. Tick. Getting the contact information turned out to be more complicated than Vanessa expected, which in itself was information. Damian Cross did not have a website. He did not have a professional profile on any platform. The phone number on file with Archon traced back to an attorney's office, a gatekeeper, clearly, someone whose job was to stand between Damian and the world on a professional level. Vanessa recognized the structure because she'd briefly considered building the same kind of wall around herself in an earlier period, before deciding she preferred to be reachable on her own terms. She called the attorney's office. She gave her name. She explained that she was the founder of Sterling Integrated Solutions and that she had a matter she'd like to discuss directly with Mr. Cross at his convenience. She said it in a tone that was professional and not pushy, which cost her something because pushiness was, in most circumstances, simply efficiency by another name. The attorney, a measured, unhurried man named Garrett Walsh, thanked her for calling. said he would pass the message along, gave no indication of when or whether she would hear back. She thanked him and hung up and drummed her fingers once on the desk. The message she wanted to send was not one she could send through an attorney. That was the problem with the situation she'd created. The formal channel was too formal for what she'd actually done, which had not been a formal transgression but a personal one, the kind that happened in public spaces and landed in the body rather than the record. She didn't hear back that day, or the next. On Friday afternoon, when she was 40 minutes from leaving the office for a weekend that she planned to spend not thinking about this, her cell phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered it. "This is Vanessa Sterling?" A pause. Then, "Ms. Sterling, this is Damian Cross." His voice was even, not warm exactly, not cold, just level, the voice of someone who had decided how much tone to use and deployed exactly that amount. Vanessa sat up straighter without meaning to. "Mr. Cross, thank you for calling." "Walsh said you wanted to speak." "I did. I do." She stopped. She'd had a version of this conversation prepared, professional, measured, the right balance of directness and humility, and now that she was in it, the prepared version felt wrong, like wearing a suit to an apology. "I wanted to reach out because I owe you one. An apology, directly." Another pause, shorter this time. "For Tuesday," she said, when he didn't fill it. "At the bank, I said something that was dismissive, and it was loud enough that I intended it to land, and it landed on the wrong person. More importantly, it was the kind of thing I shouldn't have said about anyone." Damian was quiet for a moment. She could hear faintly something in the background on his end, a window maybe, or a television in another room. "I appreciate you saying that," he said. "I mean it. I believe you do." The flatness of it wasn't unkind, but it wasn't absolution either, and Vanessa was sharp enough to recognize the difference. He was accepting the words. He was not handing her relief. "I also want you to know," she said, "that I only realized afterward who you were. The apology isn't connected to that. I'd want to say it either way. Okay? I realize that's easy to say." It is," he agreed. And then, before the silence could become uncomfortable, "I don't hold it against you." "I think maybe you should," Vanessa said, and she hadn't planned to say it, but it came out, and it was true. He didn't respond immediately. She heard him shift, the small sound of someone changing position. "I'm going to be honest with you," Damian said. "What you said in the bank didn't particularly hurt my feelings. I've been invisible for long enough that comments about the surface of things don't land the way they might have when I cared more about the surface. What it made me think, if I'm being straight with you, was that you were a person who was measuring things by the wrong scale. That's your business, not mine." Vanessa absorbed that. It wasn't comfortable to absorb. "That's fair," she said. "I didn't call to make you feel bad," Damian said. "Walsh passed the message, and I figured a call was better than going back and forth through channels. What did you actually want to discuss?" The shift in register was deliberate. She recognized it as the move of someone who was done with one part of a conversation and ready for the next. She straightened in her chair. "I'd like to meet," Vanessa said. "In person. I have some things I want to say that aren't suited for a phone call." Another pause. Then, "All right." They settled on the following Wednesday, a place he suggested, a coffee shop she hadn't heard of, somewhere in a neighborhood she didn't often have reason to be in. She wrote down the address and the time, and when she hung up, she sat very still for a moment with her hand over her phone on the desk. The coffee shop was called Linden's. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on a street that felt unhurried in the way that certain city blocks do. Not run down, just removed from the velocity of the commercial corridors a few blocks over. The windows were large and not particularly clean, which let the morning light in a diffuse, unpretentious way. The furniture was mismatched, the menu handwritten on a board behind the counter, and the noise level was the easy, low hum of people who had come here to be somewhere, not to be seen somewhere. Vanessa arrived 4 minutes early, which was unusual for her. She was typically exact to the minute because arriving early in professional settings read as eagerness, and she'd spent years calibrating against that. But she arrived early here because she felt vaguely and uncomfortably that she was the one who needed to be in position. like she'd earned the slight vulnerability of it. Damien arrived 2 minutes later. He looked exactly the same as he had in the bank. Different jacket, similar vintage, same worn-in quality to everything he wore, same unhurried walk, same way of moving into a space without announcing himself. He saw her at the corner table, nodded once, and went to the counter first, ordered something, and came over with a ceramic mug and set it on the table and sat down. "You found it all right," he said. "Easy enough." She wrapped both hands around her own coffee. "Do you come here often?" "A few times a week. The coffee's decent and nobody bothers me." He said it without any particular weight. It was just a fact. But it landed on Vanessa with a clarity that the phone call hadn't quite delivered. This was his life. These were its textures. A coffee shop where nobody bothered him. A bank visit for $50 in cash. An apartment she couldn't picture because nothing she knew about this man was visual. "I wanted to say in person what I said on the phone," she started, "because I think I said it in kind of I was a bit controlled about it, managed." Damien looked at her. His eyes were darker than she'd remembered, attentive in a way that was neither warm nor cold, but simply present. "I was rude to you," Vanessa said, "in public. I made an assumption about who you were based on how you looked, and I said something intended to demean you, and I said it loud enough that other people heard it, and I'm ashamed of that." He held her gaze for a moment. "You already said this." "I know. I'm saying it again because the phone version didn't feel like enough." Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but adjusted, like a picture being brought slightly more into focus. "You want to know what I thought about," Damien said, "after I left the bank?" "Yes." "Nothing." He picked up his mug. "I thought about whether the handyman was going to show up on time. He did, and his work was good, and I went inside and looked at some numbers and made a sandwich, and by about 6 o'clock I hadn't thought about the bank in 3 hours. He paused. "That's not me performing composure. That's just what happened." Vanessa nodded slowly. "The thing that bothered me," Damien continued, "wasn't personal to you. It was the mechanism of it. The way it worked. You walked into a room, and the room arranged itself around your expectations. People went quiet. The teller kept her eyes down. Nobody said anything because you were the kind of person it felt risky to correct." He set the mug down. "That's a specific kind of power, and I think most people who have it don't see it operating. They just see the room behaving." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "You're right. I'm not saying it to score a point." "I know you're not. That's why it's harder to hear." She looked out the window at the street. A woman walked past with a stroller, not looking up, navigating a crack in the sidewalk with practiced efficiency. "I've been thinking about what it says about the way I operate. The way I've been operating, maybe for a long time. That's yours to work out." "I know." She turned back. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to know that regardless of your answer, I'm not asking because of the investment. I'm asking because I think I've been wrong about something, and I'd like to understand what that is." He waited. "You built something real at ArcLight," she said, "something that worked, and you lost it in a way that was, from what I can gather, deeply unfair. And then you built something else, quietly, over a long time, and you chose to do all of it without anyone knowing who you were." She paused. "Why? And I'm not asking like it's a criticism. I genuinely want to understand the thinking." Damien looked at her for a long moment. The coffee shop noise moved around them. A chair scraped somewhere. Someone laughed near the door. The espresso machine ran through a cycle. "When I was building ArcLight," he said, "I spent a lot of time managing how it looked, how I looked, what the company's profile was, who was paying attention, whether we were being taken seriously by the right people." He turned the mug in his hands. "It wasn't vanity exactly. I thought it was necessary. I thought the signal was part of the substance. And then someone I trusted used that signal against me. Spent a year and a half rewriting the structure of our partnership while I was busy managing how we looked on the outside." He said it without heat, just the level recitation of a fact that had lost most of its edge. "When it was over, I understood that I'd been looking at the wrong thing the whole time. The outside-facing stuff, the credibility management. None of that was the real work. It was just noise I'd convinced myself was signal. Vanessa didn't say anything. She was listening in the full-body way she rarely listened, not cataloging, not preparing a response, just taking it in. So I stopped, Damien said. I stopped caring about who knew what I had. I started doing the actual work, which is reading and thinking and making decisions and waiting. And I found out it went much better without the performance. Because the performance was getting in the way. Because the performance was expensive, he said. It cost attention, time. It attracted the wrong kind of people and kept me in rooms I shouldn't have been spending time in. He looked at her steadily. You live inside that world. I assume you know what I mean. Vanessa laughed, a short, real sound, unexpected enough that she almost looked surprised by it. I know exactly what you mean. Then you understand why I got out of it. I understand it intellectually, she said. Living it is another thing. Yeah, Damien said. It is. The conversation settled for a moment. Outside, the unhurried street did its things. Someone on a bicycle navigated around a parked delivery truck. The light shifted as a cloud moved somewhere overhead. I want to ask you something else, Vanessa said, about the investment. And this one is about business. Damien nodded. You've been in our capital structure for 6 years and I didn't know your name. That's intentional on your part. Yes. Was there a reason you didn't want me to know? He thought about it. It wasn't about you specifically. I don't take active roles. I don't want relationships with management because those relationships create pressures that change how I think about a position. I wanted to evaluate your company on its numbers and then leave you alone to run it. That makes sense. Your company has done well, Damien said. The numbers have been good. I have no complaints. We're planning a significant expansion, Vanessa said, into 2 new regional markets. It's going to require a new capital raise. Damien looked at her. I'm not asking you to come in on it, she said quickly. That's not what this is. I just want to be transparent with you about where the company is heading, because you're a part of it, and you've been a part of it for 6 years, and you deserve to have the picture. He studied her for a moment. Send me the projections when you have them. I will. I'll look at them the same way I look at everything. No favors either direction. I'd expect nothing else. She paused. Though I'd also like to offer you a formal position as a lead investor on the new round. Not because of Tuesday, not because of this conversation, because your track record suggests you're someone whose involvement adds something beyond capital, and I'd rather have you visible in the structure where I can talk to you directly than anonymous in a holding entity where I'm reading about you from public documents. Damien was quiet. You don't have to decide now, Vanessa said. I won't, he said. I'll think about it. She nodded. That's all I'm asking. He looked at her with the same steady attention he'd had since she sat down. Not friendly exactly, not unfriendly. Something more neutral and, in its neutrality, more honest than most of the faces she dealt with in a given day. You didn't judge my wealth, he said. It was almost exactly what he'd said on the phone, but in person it landed differently. You judged who you thought I was. Those are different things. I know that now, Vanessa said. Make sure you keep knowing it, Damien said. It's easy to know things in a coffee shop and then walk back into your building and forget. She looked at him. Is that what you think will happen? He didn't answer immediately. He drank from his mug, set it down, looked at the table for a moment, and then back up at her. I think you're a smart person who runs a successful company and has spent a long time in an environment that rewards a certain way of reading people, he said. I think that environment is pretty good at convincing everyone inside it that its way of reading people is correct. And I think it probably takes more than one uncomfortable Tuesday morning to change a habit that deep. It was not a comfortable thing to hear. She absorbed it anyway. You're not wrong, she said. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. That's the thing. I don't think this is new information for you. I think you knew it before Tuesday. I think Tuesday just made it hard to look away from. Vanessa looked at him across the small table in the coffee shop with the imperfect windows and the mismatched chairs, and she thought about the 43rd floor and the marble lobby and the automatic authority of a clicking heel on a polished floor, and she felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not guilt exactly, not shame exactly, something older and less defined, the particular feeling of seeing yourself from an angle you hadn't chosen. "I should let you get on with your day," she said. Damien nodded, stood, and picked up his mug to take back to the counter because that was apparently the kind of place this was, and he was apparently the kind of person who did that. "Mr. Cross," Vanessa said. He turned. "Thank you for meeting with me." He looked at her for a moment, something in his face, not warmth, but something adjacent, the slight human relaxation of a person who has decided provisionally that a thing is worth a small amount of grace. "Take care of yourself," he said. He carried his mug to the counter, set it down, and walked out of Linden's with the same unhurried ease with which he'd walked into it. And through the smeared window, Vanessa watched him move down the sidewalk and turn a corner and disappear. And she sat alone with her coffee, which had gone cold and did not move for a long time. She drove back to the office from Linden's without music. That was unusual for Vanessa. She was someone who filled space by habit, phone calls on the road, something playing through the speakers, the ambient noise of productivity maintained even in transit. But she drove back through the mid-morning city in silence, both hands on the wheel, watching the lights change, and the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like something she needed to sit inside for a while. Cora looked up when she walked in, took one look at her, and simply said, "Your 11 o'clock called to push 30 minutes. I confirmed." "Fine," Vanessa said. "Hold everything until then?" She went into her office and closed the door and stood at the window for a while, not thinking in any directed way, just letting the conversation settle, the way you let a room settle after something has moved through it. The city below looked the same as it always did. The same grid of movement, the same geometry of ambition running on the same infrastructure. She'd looked at this view almost every day for 11 years. Right now it looked slightly different, and she couldn't have explained exactly why, because the view hadn't changed at all. It's easy to know things in a coffee shop and then walk back into your building and forget. She turned away from the window. The problem with a man like Damien Cross, and she was beginning to understand this with a clarity that had teeth, was that he was not the kind of person who issued dramatic corrections. He wasn't going to embarrass her, wasn't going to broadcast what had happened at Meridian Trust, wasn't going to use his position as a legacy investor to manufacture leverage out of her discomfort. He had none of those interests. That was precisely what made the conversation she'd just had so difficult to metabolize. There was nothing to push against. He wasn't angry at her. He wasn't performing magnanimity for an audience. He had simply looked at her across a small table and told her true things in a level voice, and then carried his mug back to the counter and left. She couldn't argue with that. She couldn't negotiate with it. She could only sit with what it reflected. Vanessa Sterling had built her company over 11 years through a combination of intelligence, discipline, and a specific kind of social fluency that she'd developed early and refined over time. The ability to read a room fast, to calibrate her positioning within it, to move through professional environments with a certainty that other people found either reassuring or intimidating, depending on where they stood relative to her interests. She was good at this. She'd needed to be good at this. She'd entered her industry at a time and in a context where the room rarely arranged itself in her favor by default, where the credibility she needed had to be established and maintained at a cost that her male counterparts didn't pay in the same way, and she'd done the work and paid the cost and built the things she wanted to build. She knew all of that was true. She also knew, sitting in her office on a Wednesday morning, that somewhere in the process of becoming the person who could survive that room, she'd developed some habits that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with dominance. And that those habits had started to run on their own, unchecked, operating at moments where nothing was actually at stake. A lobby, a line, a man in a worn jacket asking for $50. That was the thing she couldn't look away from. She made herself look at it for another minute. Then she straightened her jacket, pulled up her calendar, and went to work. The formal apology letter took her 3 evenings to write. Not because she didn't know what to say. By the second evening, she had a version that was honest and direct and said everything she'd meant. But because every time she read it back, she could hear the way it was also, beneath the sincerity, a performance of sincerity. A document that, despite her genuine intentions, was also doing the work of making Vanessa Sterling look like someone who had already processed this and emerged improved. She kept cutting it, kept stripping layers off, kept asking herself whether she was writing it for him or for the version of herself she wanted to be in the record. By the third evening, the letter was 4 paragraphs. She read it once more. It still wasn't perfect. Maybe it couldn't be because she wasn't perfect, and the thing she'd done wasn't minor, and a perfect apology for an imperfect act was its own kind of lie. But it was honest in a way that cost her something, which felt like the appropriate minimum. She sent it through Garrett Walsh's office, along with a separate formal document, a written invitation for Damian Cross to join Sterling Integrated Solutions' next expansion round as a lead investor, at terms that were, and she was clear-eyed about this, genuinely favorable. It was not a bribe. The terms were what she would offer anyone whose involvement she wanted at that level. She said so in the letter. She sent the package on a Thursday. She heard nothing for 4 days. On Monday, she heard nothing. On Tuesday, a week exactly from the morning at Meridian Trust, she was in back-to-back meetings until past 6 and didn't think about it. On Wednesday, Cora mentioned that a response had come from Walsh's office. It was a brief letter, clean letterhead, no firm name, just an address. 2.5 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledged her apology and stated simply that it was accepted. The second paragraph addressed the expansion investment. It said that he had reviewed the materials she'd sent, the preliminary projections, the market analysis, and that they were thoughtfully prepared and the underlying logic was sound. He said he would maintain his existing position in Terrace Capital's current form. He declined the lead investor role. The third paragraph was shorter than the others. It said, "The offer reflects well on you. So does the instinct that produced it. But the reason I keep my distance from management relationships isn't something I want to make exceptions to, even when the person on the other side has given me reason to think the exception might go well. Some things work because they're consistent. I'd rather stay consistent." Vanessa read it twice. Then she set it on her desk and looked at it for a while, and the feeling that moved through her was complicated in a way she didn't try to simplify. There was disappointment, genuine business disappointment, because she'd meant what she said about what his involvement could add. There was also, beneath that, something closer to respect. The letter didn't give her the thing she'd asked for, and it didn't apologize for that. And it was written by someone who had thought about what he was doing and why, and had decided without drama. She put the letter in the folder she'd been keeping on the matter, closed it, told Cora to confirm the next expansion meeting for Thursday. She had 3 other investors to call. What happened in the weeks after was not a transformation. Vanessa would have been the first to say that, and she said it twice, actually, in different conversations, the way people do when they're trying to be precise about something they've thought through carefully. The first conversation was with Marcus, her VP of Operations, who had worked with her for 8 years, and whom she trusted in the specific way you trust someone who has seen you at your worst and stayed without making a project of it. They were in her office after hours on a Thursday, going through the expansion planning, when something he said triggered a memory of what Damian had told her at Linden's, about the room arranging itself around expectations. And she mentioned it. Not the details of Tuesday, not Damian by name, just the observation itself. About what happened in rooms when a certain kind of authority was present. About whether the people inside those rooms were actually telling you true things or telling you the things that felt safe to say. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man, not timid, just precise about when he spent his words. "Can I say something honest?" he asked. "That's what I'm paying you for." He looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at her when he was deciding how direct to actually be. "There are things I've held back from saying in meetings because I've watched what happens when someone pushes back at the wrong moment. Not because you've ever actually punished anyone for it, just because the room gets a temperature and people learn to read the temperature." Vanessa looked at him. "That's useful information," she said. Her voice was level. "I figured you'd take it that way." "What have you been holding back?" He told her. It took about 20 minutes. Some of it she'd already sensed. Some of it surprised her. None of it was catastrophic, but all of it was real. And real was what she'd asked for. So she listened to all of it and took notes and did not interrupt, and at the end said, "Thank you. I mean that." "I know you do," Marcus said. "That's why I said it." The second conversation was harder. It was with a woman named Dana Cho, who ran Sterling's talent and culture operations, and who had, 14 months ago, brought Vanessa a concern about the way one of the senior directors was treating his junior staff. Not anything legally actionable, just a pattern of dismissiveness that was making people smaller and making the department quiet in ways that were starting to affect the work. Vanessa had listened, had said the right things, and had then handled it with the director in the way that felt most efficient. A quiet conversation, a warning that was too gentle, a situation that had technically been addressed and practically not changed at all. Dana had not brought another concern since then. Vanessa called her into the office on a Friday afternoon and asked her directly whether the situation with the director had improved. Dana looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long. "Marginally," she said. "On the surface." "What does that mean?" Dana took a careful breath. "It means he's learned not to do it in front of people who report upward. It means the junior staff in his department have learned not to bring things forward because the last time they did, nothing actually changed." Vanessa felt this as a physical thing somewhere in the upper chest area. "Why didn't you come back to me?" Dana's expression was careful, measured, the expression of someone who had thought about this exact question and had not been sure whether it would ever be asked. "Because the first time felt like it cost more than it returned," she said. "I didn't want to spend that again." The directness of it landed hard. Vanessa had spent her career building a company she believed treated people well, and the gap between that belief and what Dana had just described was not comfortable to measure. "I want to fix it," Vanessa said. "The actual thing, not the surface of it, and I want to know the other situations like it." Dana looked at her for a long moment. "That's going to be a longer conversation." "I have time." They were in the office for 2 more hours. Dana was careful and precise, and clearly uncertain for the first 20 minutes about how much to trust that this was real, and not just another cycle that would close down before anything actually changed. Vanessa understood that uncertainty and didn't argue with it. She just kept listening, kept asking the follow-up question instead of the summary question, and slowly the conversation opened up into something more honest than anything they'd had in the past year. It wasn't a catharsis. Vanessa didn't feel cleansed or renewed or any of the things that scenes like this were supposed to produce in a story about someone learning a lesson. What she felt was tired and clear-eyed and aware of a significant amount of work she hadn't known she needed to do. That felt more honest than transformation. 3 weeks after the meeting at Linden's, Vanessa was having lunch at her desk when her phone buzzed with a number she recognized now. She answered before the second ring. "Mr. Cross?" "Mrs. Sterling." A brief pause. "I wanted to follow up on something. The projections you sent. I had a question about your Pacific Coast expansion numbers. The timeline you're showing for market penetration in the 3rd year looks aggressive compared to the operational infrastructure you have in place right now." Vanessa set down her fork. "It is aggressive. We're planning to hire ahead of the curve. The assumption is that the talent will be in place by the time the volume requires it. That assumes the hiring timeline holds. Hiring ahead of curve in 3 markets simultaneously is a significant operational lift. What's your contingency if you're 6 months behind on staffing in one of the 3? She pulled up the projection file without thinking about it. "We have a delayed activation model built in for Market 2. If we're behind, Market 2 goes soft launch, while 1 and 3 carry the early load. Is the margin structure solid enough for that? For about 4 months. After that, we'd be looking at either accelerating the hiring or adjusting the entry terms in Market 2. A beat. "The entry terms are the more conservative play." "Probably," Vanessa said. "Marcus has been pushing for that version." "Marcus is right." "Marcus usually is," she said. "I'm working on being better at hearing that when he says it." There was a pause on Damien's end. Brief. The kind of pause that wasn't empty. "How's that going?" he asked. "Ask me in 6 months," Vanessa said. Something shifted on his end. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it. A small relaxation in the register of his voice. Something that wasn't quite warmth, but was adjacent to it in the way that certain things are only adjacent to things, never actually those things. "The contingency plan should be in the main document," he said, "not in a footnote. If you're presenting this to new investors, they need to see that you've already thought through the failure modes. It reads better as rigor, not as weakness." Vanessa made a note. "Agreed. I'll have Cora update the master version." That's all I had, Damien said. I appreciate you looking at it, Vanessa said, and then, before she thought about whether to say it, I wasn't sure you would. The numbers are still my numbers, he said. I look at what affects them. Of course, she said. Still. Another brief pause. You're running a good company, Ms. Sterling. The fundamentals are solid. The culture work you need to do isn't going to show up in the financials for a while, but it'll show up eventually. Vanessa blinked. How do you know about the culture work? I don't, specifically, but you wouldn't be doing what you described with the Marcus conversation unless something had shaken loose internally, and the only thing that shook loose was the conversation in my direction. So I assumed you'd taken it further inward. A beat. I might be wrong. You're not, she said. He didn't say anything to that. Mr. Cross, Vanessa said, can I ask you something personal? You can ask. Carter Voss, your former partner. She paused. Do you ever think about what you'd say to him if you ran into him somewhere? The silence that followed was longer than the others. Not uncomfortable. Just longer. The silence of someone who had thought about a thing for a long time and was deciding how much of that thinking to share. I used to, Damien said. First couple of years I had a whole version of it. Very satisfying. In my head. A dry note entered his voice. He never showed up to receive it. And now? Now I think I'd probably just have a normal conversation. Ask him how things were going. Mean it, more or less. He paused again. He was my friend before he was my partner. That was real. What he did was also real. Those two things are just both true. I've stopped trying to make one of them cancel the other. Vanessa was quiet. The version where I'm angry at him all the time is more expensive than it's worth, Damien said. I found that out fairly early. That's... Vanessa stopped, started again. That's harder than it sounds. Most things are, he said. That's not a useful observation, I know. No, it is, she said. It's just an uncomfortable one. She could hear him shift position. I'll let you get back to your lunch. How did you know I was eating lunch? It's 12:40. You seem like someone who eats at their desk. A pause. I might be projecting. You're not, she said. Unfortunately. There was a beat of silence that had, for the first time in any of their exchanges, a texture that wasn't purely professional, not intimate, nothing like that, just human. The brief, unremarkable warmth that exists between two people who have been honest with each other and have not destroyed each other in the process. Take care, Miss Sterling, Damien said. You too, Mr. Cross. The call ended. Vanessa set her phone on the desk and looked at her lunch for a moment. Then she picked up her fork, pulled up the projection document, and started making notes on the contingency section. Outside, the city moved. Below, the streets ran their patterns, indifferent and precise. And in Vanessa Sterling's 43rd floor office, something was shifting, slowly, imperfectly, with none of the clean resolution that people say change looks like, but shifting nonetheless, the way large things always shift. Gradually, and then with a weight that becomes impossible to ignore. She didn't think about Damien Cross for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about her company, her people, the junior staff in that director's department who had learned not to bring things forward. She thought about that for a long time. The director's name was Paul Enberg, and he had been with Sterling Integrated Solutions for 4 years, which was long enough to have developed a settled confidence in his position that had, over time, calcified into something less useful. Vanessa had promoted him 2.5 years ago. He was technically excellent, nobody questioned his competence in the domain itself, and he had a way of presenting in leadership meetings that read as authoritative, which Vanessa had, in that earlier period, confused with actually being authoritative. The distinction, she was now understanding, was meaningful. Paul Enberg knew how to look like he had things handled, what Dana Cho had described, and what Vanessa confirmed over the following 2 weeks, through a series of careful conversations with people in his department, was that the handling itself was considerably less clean than the presentation. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. What he did was subtler and in some ways more corrosive, a pattern of dismissing ideas before they were finished, of crediting his own recaps of other people's thinking rather than the thinking itself, of creating in his team a persistent low-grade uncertainty about whether it was worth opening their mouths. The junior staff had learned to root around him, which meant the best ideas in his department were dying in the hallways outside his office instead of making it into any room where they could do something useful. Vanessa had a meeting with him on a Tuesday, 3.5 weeks after Meridian Trust, which she was aware of, though she didn't think the timing needed to be explained to anyone, including herself. She did not ease into it. She thought about how to run the conversation and decided that easing into it was a kindness that would cost the wrong people. "I want to talk about your team," she said, "specifically about the environment you've built for them. I've had a number of conversations over the past 2 weeks, and what I'm hearing is consistent enough that I can't attribute it to individual personalities." Paul looked at her with the carefully managed expression of a person who has been surprised but is experienced enough not to show it fully. "I'm not sure what you've been hearing, but I'd want the opportunity to respond to specifics." "You'll have it. I'm going to give you the specifics, and I want you to hear them as information, not as an attack. Because what I want out of this conversation is for things to actually change, not for you to feel defensive and then go back to your department and behave better for 3 months and then drift." He looked at her. "That's a fairly direct way to start." "Yes," Vanessa said. "It is." She gave him the specifics. Not names. She'd been clear with Dana and the others that the conversations were informational, not testimonial, but patterns, examples described with enough detail to be undeniable. She watched his face move through the sequence that faces move through in these conversations. The initial resistance, the search for an alternate explanation, the slow and uncomfortable arrival at something closer to recognition. It took 40 minutes. He pushed back twice in ways that she let him finish before responding. He said, at one point, "I didn't realize the impact was that significant." And she said, "I believe you. That's part of what I want you to understand." And the way she said it was not cruel and also not gentle in the comfortable sense. It was just direct in the way that things are direct, when the person saying them has stopped managing the room and started just telling the truth. At the end of the meeting, Paul Enberg looked like a man who had been handed a picture of himself that he wasn't sure he recognized but couldn't fully dispute. "What I need from you," Vanessa said, "is a genuine change in how you run that department, not a performance of change. Dana is going to do a team check-in in 60 days, and I'm going to be looking at whether people feel differently about bringing things forward. If they don't, we'll need to have a different conversation about your role." "And if they do?" "Then we move forward," she said. "I'm not interested in making an example of anyone. I'm interested in fixing something that's broken." He nodded. Not with enthusiasm. With the weighted acknowledgement of someone who has just understood that something real is being asked of them. When he left, Vanessa sat back in her chair and noticed that her hands were not entirely steady. She hadn't been nervous exactly, but the conversation had cost something. The specific cost of staying honest when it would have been easier to soften things into ambiguity. She was aware of the irony that it had taken a man in a worn jacket and a $50 withdrawal to put her in the room where this conversation became possible. She sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled up the expansion document and got back to work. The Pacific Coast expansion launched 7 months later, and it went the way most real things go. Better in some dimensions than projected, worse in others, and requiring a series of mid-course corrections that Marcus had mostly anticipated and documented, and that Vanessa was, by that point, actually reading before the meetings where they were discussed, rather than getting the summary version in real time. The Market 2 soft launch contingency that Damien had flagged on that Wednesday phone call was used. They were 4 months behind on staffing in the Portland corridor, and the delayed activation model held the way it was designed to. Market 1 and 3 carried the early load. It was not a crisis. It was a plan working. Damien received the quarterly updates through Walsh's office, the way he always had. He sent back one note, about 6 months into the expansion, flagging a metric in the operational cost structure that suggested a vendor renegotiation might be worth pursuing. He was right. They pursued it. The renegotiation went well. Vanessa sent a brief acknowledgement through the same channel. He didn't respond to the acknowledgement, which was consistent with everything she now understood about how he operated. Their phone calls had settled into an occasional rhythm. Not scheduled, not frequent, Maybe once every 6 or 8 weeks, always initiated by him and always focused on something specific in the numbers. The conversations were short and productive and almost entirely professional. Almost. There was by now a quality to them that had no business name, just the easy shorthand of two people who had been honest with each other and had developed, without planning to, a mutual regard that neither of them was inclined to analyze too directly. She still called him Mr. Cross. He still called her Ms. Sterling. She'd thought about suggesting they drop that at some point, and then decided not to, because the formality felt, oddly, like something they'd both chosen, and that choosing it said something worth keeping. It was Dana Cho who told Vanessa, on a Thursday afternoon 11 months after Meridian Trust, that the 60-day check-in for Paul Enberg's department had been followed by a 90-day, and then a 6-month, and that the most recent round of feedback from his team showed a genuine shift in the numbers. Not dramatic, not the kind of before and after that made a good slide, but real. People were bringing things forward. The routing around had stopped. A junior analyst named Kwame had apparently presented an operational efficiency proposal directly to Paul last month that Paul had not only listened to but championed upward with Kwame's name attached. "That last part is the tell," Dana said. "Yeah," Vanessa agreed. "It is." She thought about what it had taken to get there. The conversation with Dana, the conversation with Marcus, the meeting with Paul, the 2 weeks of uncomfortable conversations before all of those, where she'd sat with the picture of herself and looked at it without flinching away, or tried to, and hadn't always succeeded, but had kept trying. She thought about Damien saying, "It's easy to know things in a coffee shop and then walk back into your building and forget." She hadn't forgotten. That was the thing she was most honest with herself about in the quiet moments. That she could have. That many people did. That the particular comfort of returning to a familiar environment was precisely its ability to absorb disruption and smooth it back into the existing pattern, and that the only defense against that was repetition. Returning to the uncomfortable picture every time the familiar started to feel like enough. It wasn't a transformation, it was a practice, and she was better at it some weeks than others. The thing that happened in December wasn't planned. Vanessa was on Calloway Street for a meeting with an attorney whose office was a block from Meridian Trust, and she had 20 minutes between the meeting's end and her next call, and she walked past the bank without stopping, glanced through the glass at the marble lobby, at the counter where Priya still worked on weekday mornings, at the small seating area near the back wall where Gerald Taft had once invited a man in a worn jacket to sit and review his statements. She kept walking, got half a block, stopped at a crossing. The light was red. Around her, the city moved in its usual pressured rhythm, people threading gaps between other people, a cab accelerating through the far intersection, the white noise of a Tuesday in motion. She took her phone out and pulled up Damien's number, put it back, thought about it, took it out again. He answered on the third ring. "Ms. Sterling." "I'm standing on Calloway Street," she said. "Half a block from Meridian Trust. I thought you should know." A pause, then with something that was unmistakably dry. "Why would I need to know that?" "I don't know," she said. "I just thought it was worth telling someone, that I could walk past it now without the feeling I had the first time I walked past it, after Tuesday." A brief silence. What feeling was that? The feeling of someone who had said something they couldn't take back, Vanessa said. In a room full of people, about a person they'd just decided was worth less than the marble they were standing on. She looked at the bank through the foot traffic. That feeling. Damien was quiet for a moment. The light in front of her turned green and she didn't move, and the people around her moved around her like water around a post. "It's a useful feeling to remember," he said. "I know. I'm not trying to get rid of it. I'm saying it's different now. It sits differently." She paused. "I think that's because something actually changed instead of me just deciding something changed. The difference has a texture." What changed? She thought about Paul Enberg and Dana Cho and Kwame's proposal going upward with his name on it. About Marcus saying there are things I've been holding back. About the director's department and the routing around that had stopped. "Enough things," she said. "I'll tell you the specific list another time." "All right." The light had cycled back to red. She still hadn't moved. "Mr. Cross," she said, Can I ask you something I've been thinking about for a while? You've been asking me things you've been thinking about for a while since our first phone call, he said. I don't know why you're still asking permission. The laugh came out before she could manage it, short and real. Fair point, she collected herself. After everything that happened at Arclight, after Carter Voss and the settlement and the 2 years you spent not doing anything professionally visible, did you ever feel like what happened to you was wrong? Like it should have gone differently, and the fact that it didn't meant something was broken in the way things worked? A longer silence this time. Yes, Damien said, regularly, for about 3 years. And then? And then I got tired of that too. He paused. Not because I'd made peace with it in some complete way, more because the question of whether it was wrong stopped being useful. It was wrong, that's settled. What I did with the time after, that was still open. That was the only part I could actually touch. Vanessa listened. The anger about what Carter did, Damien continued, was real. I'm not going to tell you I processed it cleanly. I didn't. There were months where it was the main thing running in the background, that background hum of something unresolved that colors everything else. But what I noticed was that the angrier I stayed, the more the whole thing stayed centered on him. On what he'd done, on what I'd lost because of him. A beat. I didn't want him to be that central anymore, so I stopped feeding the part of me that kept him there. That's not easy, Vanessa said. No, Damien agreed. It isn't, and I didn't do it gracefully. I'm not telling you I reached some clear moment of release. I'm telling you it was a slow and boring process of choosing other things to put my attention on until Carter Voss slowly stopped being the main character in my own story. Vanessa stood on the sidewalk with traffic sounds around her and December cold threading in at the collar of her coat and the bank half a block behind her and Damien's voice in her ear, and something in what he'd just said landed in a place she hadn't known was waiting for it. The main character in my own story. She'd spent 11 years building a company that bore her name. She was, in every professional sense, the main character in the room. But she understood, hearing him say it, that there were rooms inside herself where other people had been running things for longer than she'd noticed, where the need to be read correctly, to be taken seriously, to be ahead of whatever judgment might be coming, had been driving things in ways she hadn't chosen and hadn't examined. I think I've been trying to be the main character in other people's stories for a long time, she said. It came out more honestly than she'd planned. Damien said nothing for a moment. Then, most people who operate at your level are. It's almost a job requirement. That doesn't make it right. No, he said. It doesn't. But it makes it human. The question isn't whether you did it. The question is whether you keep doing it now that you can see it. The light in front of her was green again. She stepped off the curb and crossed. I'm working on it, she said. That's all there is, Damien said. Working on it. There's no version where you're done working on it. Anyone who thinks they're done is just not paying attention anymore. She made it to the other side of the street. The attorney's block was behind her now. She was walking without direction, just moving through the December city with her phone at her ear, not because she was lost, but because the conversation was worth the walking. You're a strange person to talk to, she said. How so? You're honest in a way that doesn't feel like a performance of honesty, she said. Most people who are honest about difficult things are doing something with it. You're just saying it. A brief pause. Is that unusual? In my experience, very. He made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. I spent a long time around people who used honesty as a weapon or a signal. After a while, it was just easier to actually mean it, less to keep track of. Less to keep track of, Vanessa repeated. That should be on a motivational poster somewhere. Please don't do that, Damien said. She laughed again, a fuller sound this time, less startled by itself. Around her, the city did its December things, cold and bright and indifferent, and she walked through it feeling lighter than she had when she'd started walking, which wasn't transformation and wasn't resolution, but was something real. I'll let you go, she said. I don't even know why I called. You were on Calloway Street, he said. You said so. Right, she said. That was the reason. Take care of yourself, Ms. Sterling. You too, Mr. Cross. Damien Cross put the phone down and went back to the spreadsheet on his desk. Outside his window, December was doing the thing December did. Gray and cold, the trees on his street bare, the light coming in at the low, flat angle of the short days. He'd made coffee an hour ago, and it had gone cold, which was a habit he had, and accepted without fighting it. He picked it up anyway, drank what was left, set the mug on the edge of the desk where it had left a ring from the previous 3 times. He looked at the numbers on his screen for a while. They were orderly and told a coherent story, the way good numbers did. He'd been looking at a new position for the past 2 weeks, a manufacturing company out of the Midwest that made components for medical equipment and had been misread by the market in a way that Damien found interesting, the same pattern he'd seen before, where the conventional read was built on the wrong assumptions and the correct read was visible if you looked at the operational data instead of the surface narrative. He would probably take the position. Not immediately. He'd look at it for another month, let the thinking settle, make sure he wasn't in love with the idea of being right. That was the rule he'd lived by for 11 years. The quality of the thinking mattered more than the speed of the decision. Most people got that backward. They moved fast because moving fast felt like competence, and they called it conviction. Damien had learned the difference between conviction and impatience the hard way. In a conference room with Carter Voss 11 years ago, when the documents he'd signed in a hurry because he trusted the man across the table had turned out to contain a structure he hadn't fully read, he didn't think about Carter much anymore. That was true. When the thought came, and it still came, less often than before, but it came, it had lost the heat it used to carry. What was left was closer to a historical fact about his own life. Something that had happened. Something that had shaped the shape of things. A scar that had healed, not in the sense of leaving no trace, because it left plenty of trace, but in the sense that it was part of the skin now, and not an open thing. He'd made something out of the years after. That was the real answer to all of it, and he didn't need an audience for the answer. He thought briefly about Vanessa Sterling standing on Calloway Street in December, 1 block from a bank lobby where she'd said something she couldn't take back, calling him to report that the feeling had changed. He found that he was glad it had changed. Not in a sentimental way, not in the way that made a story with a moral at the end. Just in the way you're glad when someone is doing the harder thing instead of the easier one, because the world is marginally better with people in it who are doing the harder thing. He didn't know if she'd sustain it. He was honest enough with himself to hold that uncertainty. He'd watched enough people have the hard conversation and feel the genuine shift, and then slowly allow the familiar to reclaim them, not out of bad faith, but out of the sheer persistent gravity of environment and habit. It was the most human failure. Not wickedness, just the slow drift back toward comfort. But she'd called from Calloway Street. That was something. People who were drifting back didn't make that call. He opened a new file, started a notes document on the manufacturing company, wrote 3 observations about the operational data. Stopped, looked out the window at the bare trees on his street. He thought, not for the first time, about what a strange shape his life had taken. Not unhappy. That was important to be accurate about. Not the monk's life of renunciation it might look like from the outside, just different from what he'd expected when he was 30 and building something with Carter Voss and believing that the signal was the substance. He'd lost the signal and found the substance. That was the whole of it, condensed. The $50 he'd withdrawn from Meridian Trust on that Tuesday in October had gone to a handyman named Bert, who fixed gutters and worked off the books and did excellent, clean work without being asked twice. The gutter hadn't given him any trouble since. That was $50 well spent, by any measure he cared about. The rest of it, Vanessa Sterling, and the coffee shop, and the 4 phone calls, and the formal letter, and the declined opportunity, and the December sidewalk, had cost nothing and returned something he hadn't been looking for and wouldn't have known to name. Not friendship exactly, not business exactly, just an honest connection between 2 people who had seen each other clearly for a moment and had been honest about what they'd seen and had not destroyed each other with it. He'd take that. He went back to his numbers. There is a particular kind of wealth that never shows on a balance sheet, not because it's hidden, but because the tools we use to measure things can only measure certain kinds of things, and we tend to mistake the limitation of our tools for the limitation of what exists. Damien Cross understood this. He'd learned it the way most real understanding gets learned, Not from reading it somewhere, not from someone telling him, but from living a long enough version of two different lives to be able to compare them directly. The first life, where the signal was the substance. The second, where the substance was all there was. He knew which one had been harder to build and which one had turned out to hold its weight. Vanessa Sterling was learning it, unevenly and imperfectly, and at a cost she was still calculating. She would probably spend the rest of her career learning it, which was the correct timeline for a lesson that size. She was sharper than she'd been at the start of October, and more honest with herself, and her company was marginally better for it in ways that would take years to fully measure. Paul Enberg was doing something harder than he'd done before. Dana Cho had started bringing things forward again. Kwame's name was on his own proposal. None of it was complete. None of it was the clean resolution that made a satisfying ending if you needed your endings clean. The director would have good months and difficult months. Vanessa would walk back into rooms where the old habits waited, and she would win some of those encounters and lose others. Damien would make a bad investment eventually, because everyone does, and he would sit with it and work through it and adjust and keep going. But here's what was true, and what remained true underneath all the imperfection and incompleteness. A man had walked into a bank in a worn jacket and asked for $50. And in the gap between what he looked like and what he was, something had been exposed that the marble lobby and the clicking heels and the weight of accumulated authority had kept covered. Not a secret, not a scandal, just a simple and old and persistent human error. The error of deciding what a person is worth before you've understood what a person is. The error is easy to make. It is made constantly by people who are not cruel and not stupid, by people who have built real things and done real work and earned real respect. It runs beneath the surface of professional life, like a current nobody maps, because everybody's swimming in it. And it costs things that don't show up in the quarterly report. It costs the idea in the hallway that never made it to the room, the person who learned not to bring things forward, the junior analyst who routed around the director because the director's room had a temperature. What Damien Cross had, at the end of all of it, was the thing he'd built slowly and without an audience across 11 years of patient, unglamorous, precise work. Not just the financial position, though that was real and solid, and the product of discipline applied over a long time horizon, but the more durable thing beneath it. The ability to walk into a marble lobby in a worn jacket and ask for $50 and feel when a woman's voice carried across the space with a dismissal in it, not wounded, but simply clear-eyed. The ability to need nothing from that room, to take the $50, fold them into his jacket pocket, and step out into the gray afternoon without looking back. True weight doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just sits, steady and patient, while everything lighter makes noise around it. Damien Cross closed his laptop at 6 o'clock. The December dark had come early, and the street outside his window was lit by the amber of the neighborhood lamps, and it was quiet in the way his street was usually quiet by this hour. He put on his jacket, the faded one, the one he'd worn to the bank, the one that would have told a certain kind of observer everything they needed to know and told them all of it wrong. And he went out to get dinner from the place around the corner that made a decent bowl of soup and didn't care what he was wearing. He walked through the cold air with his hands in his pockets and his breath making small clouds in front of him. And the street was ordinary and unhurried, and he was a man walking through it, anonymous and unread and completely at peace with both of those things. He had built what he wanted to build. He lived the way he wanted to live. He answered to no one's idea of what he should be. That was the fortune. That was the whole of it. Everything else was just numbers. Damien ordered the soup and ate it at the small counter by the window the way he usually did. Not because he preferred eating alone, but because the alternative required a kind of social arrangement he rarely had reason to make. The place was called Moreno's, and it occupied a narrow slot between a dry cleaner and a hardware store. And the man who ran it was a compact, unhurried person named Felix, who had been making the same 4 soups on rotation for as long as Damien had been coming in, which was going on 6 years. Felix set the bowl down without ceremony and went back to whatever he'd been doing behind the counter. That was one of the things Damien liked about the place. Nobody performed hospitality at you. He ate slowly and looked out the window at the December street. A couple walked past bundled against the cold, the woman saying something that made the man laugh, his breath coming out in a cloud. An older man walked a dog that was moving with the labored determination of an animal who had done this walk many times and had opinions about the pace. A delivery truck idled at the corner with its hazards on, the driver inside looking at a phone. Ordinary. All of it completely ordinary. Damien had spent a long time learning to find that restful rather than insufficient. There had been a period, longer than he liked to admit, in the first years after Arclight, when ordinary had felt like defeat. When he'd sat in coffee shops and watched the city move and felt, underneath the surface calm he was working to cultivate, the specific ache of someone who had been in motion for years and had suddenly stopped. Not grief exactly. More like the phantom sensation of a limb that was no longer there. He'd been building something, and then he wasn't, and the absence of the building had a texture he hadn't anticipated. He'd mistaken that texture for unhappiness for longer than was useful. It had taken him the better part of 2 years to understand that what he was feeling wasn't the absence of enough. It was the withdrawal symptom of a specific kind of stimulation he'd been running on for so long that he'd confused it with living. The rebuilding had been quieter than the original. That was probably the most accurate way to describe the difference. Arclight had been built with noise. The noise of two people arguing about everything productively, the noise of a team expanding, the noise of deals closing and problems solved, and the constant forward pressure of a company that was trying to become something larger than it currently was. Damien had loved that noise. He'd thought he needed it. What he found, in the years after, was that he didn't need it. He'd needed the thinking that produced the noise. And the thinking could happen in silence just as well, probably better, without the noise of managing how the thinking looked to other people. He finished the soup. Felix collected the bowl without comment. Damien sat for another few minutes with his water glass, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting in the amber warmth of Moreno's while the December dark pressed against the window. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from his accountant, Ray, flagging a tax document that needed attention before the end of the year. Damien replied, "I'll call you Thursday." Ray sent back a thumbs up. He put the phone in his pocket and left. Shab. Ray Okafor had been Damien's accountant for 9 years, which made him one of the longest continuous professional relationships in Damien's current life. He was a careful, meticulous man in his late 50s who had a gift for making complex financial structures feel navigable and who asked almost no personal questions, which was a quality Damien had come to value as highly as his technical competence. They met Thursday morning in Ray's office, which was in a mid-rise building about 20 minutes from Damien's neighborhood, on a floor that also housed a dental practice and a small immigration law firm. The office was tidy in the particular way of someone who thought in systems. Everything in a category, categories clearly labeled, nothing left where it didn't belong. Ray walked him through the year-end document. It was straightforward, mostly. A couple of positions that had moved in ways that required specific handling, a property tax matter that needed a form filed before January, the standard architecture of a year closing itself out. They worked through it efficiently. Ray answered 2 questions from Damien about the manufacturing company position, flagging the tax implications of the entry timing. Damien adjusted his thinking accordingly. Near the end of the meeting, Ray set a folder on the desk that wasn't part of the year-end package. "Something I wanted to flag separately," Ray said. "Not urgent, but worth your attention." Damien looked at the folder. "What is it?" "It's Carter Voss." The name arrived the way it always arrived, with a slight internal shift, the body's memory of an old weight. Damien kept his expression neutral. "What about him?" "Arclight's acquire has been going through a restructuring. Some of the assets from the original acquisition are being reevaluated. There's a package of intellectual property that traces back to the original Arclight system's architecture." Ray opened the folder. Carter Voss filed a claim on some of it last year through a holding company. The claim was disputed and it's been in arbitration. The arbitration concluded 3 weeks ago. He paused. He lost. Damien looked at the documents Ray slid across the desk. The arbitration summary, a legal brief, a financial assessment of what the disputed IP was worth. He read through them carefully. The picture they assembled was not one he'd been tracking, but it wasn't surprising either. Carter Voss had spent the years since the Arclight acquisition doing the same thing he'd always done. Moving fast, leveraging positions, restructuring arrangements in ways that looked sharp until they looked like something else. The IP claim was consistent with that pattern. An aggressive move to capture value from something he'd had a hand in building, pressed through a legal channel, and then lost when the arbitration panel looked closely enough at the original ownership structure. The losing had cost him. The financial assessment made that clear. Damien set the papers down. Ray was watching him with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that this was not purely a business matter and was waiting to take his cue. "Does this affect anything on our end?" Damien asked. Ray shook his head. "No direct impact. The ArcLight IP was never part of your post-settlement position. This is entirely on the acquirer's side. I flagged it because I thought you'd want to know, not because you need to do anything." Damien nodded. He looked at the arbitration summary again for a moment. Then he closed the folder and pushed it back toward Ray. "File it," he said. "I don't need to keep a copy." Ray nodded, made a note. "There's one more thing." He hesitated, which was unusual for Ray. He was not a man who hesitated. "The attorney who handled the arbitration for the acquirer reached out to our office, indirectly. They're aware of your history with ArcLight, and they wanted to know if you'd be willing to provide a statement about the original IP development, as a potential witness in a follow-on proceeding." Damien was quiet for a moment. "What kind of follow-on proceeding?" "It's not fully defined yet. The arbitration loss has opened some questions about representations Carter made to the acquirer at the time of the original sale, whether they were accurate." Ray paused. "There's a suggestion that he may have overstated his ownership role in certain elements of the system architecture." Damien sat with that. The room was quiet. Through the wall, faintly, the sounds of the dental practice next door. A drill, briefly, then silence. He thought about what it would mean to be a witness in a proceeding against Carter Voss. He thought about the version of himself that had sat at a folding table 11 years ago and built a whole speech in his head. The satisfying, perfectly constructed confrontation that had never happened because Carter Voss had never shown up to receive it. He thought about what he'd told Vanessa Sterling in the coffee shop. "I'd probably just have a normal conversation. Ask him how things were going." He thought about whether that was still true. "Tell them no," Damien said. Ray looked at him. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." He picked up his water glass. "Whatever happened in that arbitration is their business. I don't have a stake in it, and I don't want one. I'm not going to spend time in a legal proceeding about events from 11 years ago when the outcome doesn't affect me. It might affect Carter Voss significantly." "I know," Damien said. "That's still not a reason." Ray studied him for a moment. Not questioning the decision, Ray had learned not to question Damien's decisions once they were made. Just looking at the man who had made it with the mild curiosity of someone who had known him long enough to find him occasionally surprising. "All right," Ray said. He made another note. "I'll let them know." Damien stood to leave. At the door he paused. "Ray, how long have we been working together?" Ray glanced up. 9 years in February." Damien nodded. "You do good work," he said. "I don't think I've said that directly." Ray's expression moved slightly. A contained version of being pleased, the kind that didn't overflow. "I appreciate that." "I mean it." He left Ray's office and took the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the December cold, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets and the city doing its usual things around him. And he felt, for a moment, the specific clean quality of a decision that had cost nothing and taken nothing, and also, in some way he didn't try to explain, released something that had been quietly waiting to be released. Carter Voss would find his own reckoning, or he wouldn't. That was Carter's story to live in. Damien had his own. He walked back toward his neighborhood. The cold was honest and direct, the kind that didn't apologize for itself. He walked in it with the ease of someone who had somewhere to be that wasn't urgent, which was its own kind of luxury, one of the real ones, the kind that didn't require an audience. Vanessa had a habit she'd developed sometime in the late fall, without planning to, of pausing at the door to certain meetings before she went in. Not long. Maybe 10 seconds. She'd stand just outside the conference room or the office, and she'd ask herself a question that she hadn't started asking until somewhere around October, when a man she barely knew had told her the room arranges itself around your expectations. The question was, what am I assuming about the people on the other side of this door? Sometimes the answer was straightforward. Sometimes it was more complicated. Sometimes she caught herself mid-assumption, holding something she hadn't known she was carrying, and the catching was the whole point. It wasn't a transformation. She'd made peace with that word's absence from the description of what was happening to her. Transformations were for stories that needed clean arcs. What she was living was more incremental and more honest. A daily, imperfect renegotiation of habits that had been laid down over years and were not going to lift cleanly just because she'd decided to notice them. But she was noticing them. That was real. She noticed it in a board meeting in November when a junior analyst named Terrence presented a quarterly risk assessment, and Vanessa caught herself dismissing his framing before he'd finished his second sentence. And instead of letting the dismissal drive her response, she waited. She asked a question instead of offering a correction. Terrence's answer was partially wrong and partially more right than her initial instinct had given him credit for, and the meeting went somewhere more useful than it would have. She noticed it in a hiring decision in December when she was reviewing candidates for a senior operations role and found herself giving disproportionate weight to the candidate who had the most polished professional presentation, the one who moved through the interview the way Vanessa herself moved through rooms. And she made herself slow down and look at the substance behind the surface of each candidate with more care than she'd been applying. She didn't hire the most polished one. She hired the woman who'd stumbled twice in the interview and had both times corrected herself with a precision that suggested she understood her own thinking clearly enough to catch it when it went wrong. That woman, whose name was Ingrid, turned out to be excellent. She was still finding her footing in the company's culture 4 months in, still making the adjustment errors that new people made, but the quality of her thinking was real, and Vanessa knew she would have missed it in the previous version of how she ran a hiring room. She told Marcus about it. They were walking back from a lunch meeting, moving through the cold with their coats up, and she described the hiring process without naming it as a change, just as what had happened. Marcus listened. When she finished, he said, "That's different from how you usually do it." "I know," Vanessa said. "It's better," Marcus said. Not as a compliment, just as an assessment, the way Marcus delivered most things, direct and without decoration. She nodded. They walked the rest of the block without talking, which was one of the things she valued about Marcus after 8 years, the absence of the need to fill every silence with something that made the silence more comfortable. January arrived the way January always did in the city, stripping everything back to its functional minimum, the cold making the streets more honest, people moving through them with less performance and more purpose. Vanessa liked January for that reason, though she'd never said so to anyone because it sounded like the kind of thing that invited more conversation than she wanted to have. She was in the office by 7 most mornings that month, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what she was doing in the first hour before Cora arrived and the day officially began. She'd started keeping a notebook, a physical one, spiral-bound, nothing special, in which she wrote observations about her own decision-making. Not a journal exactly, more like field notes on a subject she was studying, which happened to be herself. She'd started it after a conversation with Dana Cho in late November, where Dana had said something that had stayed with Vanessa longer than most things said to her. They'd been talking about the culture work and the changes in Paul Enberg's department and the general direction of things, and Dana had asked carefully what had started all of it, what had made October different from September. Vanessa had told her the truth. Not all of it. She hadn't explained the bank or Damien Cross or the specifics, but the essential shape of it, that something had happened that had shown her a version of herself she hadn't chosen to look at before, and that looking at it directly had been difficult and had also been the only way forward that felt worth taking. Dana had been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, "How do you make sure you don't stop looking?" Vanessa hadn't had an answer for that in the moment. The notebook was her answer to it, worked out over the following weeks. A place to look, a practice of looking. Nothing elaborate, just 10 minutes in the early morning, writing down the decisions from the day before and the assumptions that had driven them, noting where the gap between assumption and outcome had been significant. It was uncomfortable reading some mornings. That was how she knew it was working. She wrote about Terrence in the board meeting, about Ingrid's hiring, about a conversation with a vendor in which she'd caught herself speaking over the vendor's legal counsel because the counsel was young and soft-spoken, and she'd made a calculation about how much his words were worth before he'd finished saying them. She'd stopped mid-interruption, apologized, and let him finish. He'd made a point that changed her position on the contract term. She wrote about the moments she didn't catch until afterward. Those were the more useful entries she'd found. Not the ones where she'd corrected herself in real time, but the ones where she'd gone through the whole interaction on autopilot and only noticed the pattern in retrospect. Those were the ones that told her where the work was still unfinished, which was essentially everywhere. She didn't show the notebook to anyone. It wasn't for anyone. That was the point of it. It was on a Wednesday in late January that Gerald Taft called. Vanessa didn't know Gerald Taft personally. She knew him by role and by the fact that his name had appeared in the mental picture she'd constructed of that Tuesday morning. The branch manager who had come out from the back hallway and extended his hand to a man in a worn jacket with the particular careful respect of someone who understood what he was looking at. Gerald called her direct line, which surprised her. She answered, expecting something else. "Ms. Sterling," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting. My name is Gerald Taft. I'm the branch manager at the Callaway Street location of Meridian Trust." "I know who you are," Vanessa said. "What can I do for you, Mr. Taft?" A pause. "I'll be straightforward, since I suspect you'd prefer that. One of my tellers came to me recently with a concern about something that happened in the branch back in October. She'd been sitting with it for a while before she brought it forward, which I understand. These things aren't always easy to raise." Vanessa was very still. She described an incident in which a client was spoken to in a dismissive way by another patron, Gerald said, in the lobby. She didn't file a formal complaint at the time, and the client in question didn't request any follow-up, so it wasn't escalated. But she's been bothered by it, and she asked me whether there was anything the branch should have done differently. "What did you tell her?" Vanessa asked. "I told her that the branch's responsibility was primarily to the client who was affected, and that since that client had not raised a concern and had by all accounts handled the moment with considerable composure, there wasn't a formal action required." He paused. "But I also told her that her instinct to be bothered by it was correct, and that the fact that she'd sat with it long enough to bring it forward said something good about her." Vanessa looked at the window. Outside, January was doing what January did. "Why are you calling me, Mr. Taft?" Another brief pause. "Because the client she described is someone I have a long relationship with professionally, and because the other patron she described was identified to me through means I won't go into, and that person is you." He said it without accusation, just level, the way someone says a fact they've decided to say. "I'm not calling to make a complaint or to escalate anything formally. The client hasn't asked for that and wouldn't want it. I'm calling because I believe in being direct when the situation calls for it, and because I thought you might want to know that the moment was seen by more people than you may have realized." The line was quiet for a moment. "It was seen by more people than I realized," Vanessa said. "I've understood that for a while." "I suspected you might have," Gerald said. "The teller," Vanessa said. "Priya." A slight pause. "I'm not going to confirm or deny a staff member's name." "You don't need to." Vanessa looked at her desk. The notebook was closed in the drawer. She kept her eyes down the whole time. She was doing exactly what you train people to do. Stay professional, stay out of it. She was right to do it. "She was," Gerald agreed. "She's a good employee." "She deserves to hear that from you," Vanessa said. "If she hasn't already." "She has," Gerald said. "Recently." Vanessa nodded at no one. "Mr. Taft, I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that it's not a request for confidential client information. I'm asking as a person, not as a banking matter." "Go ahead," Gerald said carefully. "The man she was concerned about, is he all right? I don't mean financially, I mean generally." Gerald was quiet for a moment in a way that told her he was deciding something. "I believe he is," he said finally. "He came in last week. He was the same as he always is." A brief pause, and then something entered his voice that was almost warmth. He asked after the staff by name. "He does that." Vanessa closed her eyes for a second. "Thank you," she said, "for calling." "Thank you for receiving it the way you did," Gerald said. "That's not always how it goes." They said goodbye, and she put the phone down and sat in her office with the quiet of early afternoon around her and the notebook in the drawer and January outside the window. And she thought about a man who came into a bank and asked after the staff by name, who carried his mug back to the counter at a coffee shop, who declined opportunities and maintained positions and told true things in a level voice and walked through the world needing nothing from it that the world hadn't already agreed to give. She opened the drawer, opened the notebook, wrote one line. He asks after the staff by name. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and picked up her phone and went back to work. February came and the expansion continued finding its shape. The Portland corridor staffing problem resolved in the 6th week of the month, faster than the contingency model had assumed, because Ingrid, new to the role but precise in her execution, had restructured the hiring pipeline in a way that shortened the candidate to offer timeline significantly. Marcus noted it in the weekly update with the exact same tone he noted everything, which was no tone at all, but Vanessa caught the slight emphasis in the way he'd underlined the metric. She mentioned it to Ingrid directly, walked to her office, knocked on the open door, said, "The Portland numbers moved. I know why. Good work." Ingrid looked slightly startled, not by the praise, Vanessa thought, but by the directness of the delivery, the absence of the praise being embedded in a larger performance review context or a meeting agenda. Just a door knock and a fact. "Thank you," Ingrid said. "The old timeline had 3 unnecessary approval gates in it. I took them out." Why hadn't anyone taken them out before? Ingrid considered this carefully, the way she considered most things. "I think no one wanted to imply the process that was already in place was wrong." Vanessa nodded. "That's a problem I'm working on," she said. "The fact that that was the calculation." "I know," Ingrid said. "I could tell when I got here. Things are better than they were, I think." "How can you tell? You've only been here 4 months." Ingrid tilted her head slightly. "People talk in hallways, not about problems, about ideas. That's the difference. When the culture is pressurized, people take the ideas to their desks and leave the safe conversations for the hallways. When it's loosening up, the ideas start appearing in the hallways." Vanessa stood in the doorway and looked at the woman she'd hired because she'd corrected herself twice in an interview and done it with precision. "Write that down somewhere," Vanessa said. "That's a useful diagnostic." Ingrid smiled. "A real one, unmanaged." "Already in my notes." "Yeah." Damien took the manufacturing position in mid-February. He'd looked at it for the full 2 months he'd said he would, gone back through the operational data 3 times, asked Ray to look at the tax structure twice, and sat with the thesis until he was sure he wasn't in love with being right. He was, as far as he could tell, not in love with being right. The numbers told a coherent story independent of any desire he might have to be the person who'd read them correctly. He took the position at a price that would have seemed deeply counterintuitive to most observers, and which he was comfortable with for exactly that reason. He told no one except Ray and Garrett Walsh, who needed to know for their respective purposes. He did not tell Vanessa Sterling because it wasn't relevant to anything she was involved in, and because the impulse to tell her was, he recognized, the mild human impulse to share something you're pleased about with someone whose opinion you've come to hold in some regard. He noticed the impulse. He didn't act on it. That was the kind of discipline his life was built on, not the dramatic refusals, but the small daily choices about what to feed and what to let pass. What he did instead was go for a walk. He walked his neighborhood in the February cold, which had a quality he associated with clarity, the kind of day where the air was sharp enough that everything presented itself directly, without the soft edges that warmer weather tended to produce. He walked without a destination, just moving through the grid of streets that had become, over 6 years, as familiar as any place he'd lived. He knew which house had the dog that barked at everything, and which one had the owner who'd planted bulbs along the front walk that came up every spring in colors that didn't match, and were somehow better for it. He knew the corner where the wind cut through between buildings with particular efficiency, and the block where an enormous old oak had cracked the sidewalk in 2 places, and the city had been meaning to fix it for at least 3 years. He walked through all of it and felt, in the particular understated way he'd learned to receive good things, satisfied. Not triumphant, not validated, just satisfied the way you are when a decision you've thought through carefully is finally made and you can stop thinking about it and let it run. He thought, somewhere in the middle of the walk, about what Ray had said in January. about the look on Ray's face when Damien had told him he did good work, the mild, contained pleasure of it, the way Ray had said, "I appreciate that," and meant something larger than the words. Damien thought about how rarely he said things like that. Not because he didn't think them, he thought them regularly. But the thinking didn't always make it to the saying, and the gap between them was, he understood, a place where something real failed to travel. He'd been good, over the years, at the solitude. Less good at the reaching. He told himself the solitude was a preference, and it was, but he'd also used it as a perimeter in ways that weren't always honest. The people he kept close were kept close in a specific, managed way, available when he chose, at a distance that felt safe. Sylvie had named it in the last months before things ended, and he'd acknowledged it without fully receiving it, which was a failure he'd understood only in retrospect, the way most failures become visible. He wasn't going to rebuild a social architecture he'd spent a decade quietly dismantling. That wasn't the point. The point was just to be honest about what the architecture was and why, instead of calling all of it preference. He stopped at the corner with the broken sidewalk, looked at the crack in the concrete that the oak's roots had been working at for years, patient and indifferent, doing what roots do. The tree didn't know it was a problem. It was just growing in the direction growth went. The sidewalk would get fixed eventually, or it wouldn't. The tree would keep growing either way. He took his phone out, texted a man named Gil who had been his closest friend before Arclight and had remained, across all the years and distances, a kind of North Star in the otherwise sparse social landscape of his current life. The text said, "You free for dinner sometime this month?" Gil replied in 4 minutes. Finally, "Yes. When?" Damien put his phone away and walked back toward his house. The cold was the same as it had been all morning, honest and direct and not apologizing for itself. He walked in it comfortably, a man in a worn jacket on a broken sidewalk in February, needing nothing from the city that the city wasn't already providing.